The Presbyterian Church knows all too well the difficulties of talking about race. The denomination split in the 19th century over slavery and didn't reunite until 1983. But the Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbytery of Chicago also have a long history of confronting racism inside and outside the church. To talk about that role, let's welcome Joyce Perry, co-moderator of the Presbytery's Antiracism Planning and Design Task Force and an elder at Community Presbyterian Church in Broadview, Illinois. We also welcome Derek Dawson, co-program coordinator for Chicago ROAR, Regional Organizing for Antiracism. And we welcome Chris Wienbas, Anti-Racism Task Force co-moderator and co-director of Older Adult Ministries at Clarendon Hills Presbyterian Church. So tell us how the Presbytery and the CROAR relationship formed.
Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism had actually been in contact with Barbara Wilson soon after she arrived in Chicago.
Okay.
Because Barbara had a relationship with the director of networking for the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago.
Great.
And so through that relationship, Barbara contacted us. And what Chicago ROAR does is partner with organizations like the Presbytery at that point to help them figure out, now that we have money, or how do we get the money in the budget, and then where do we go from there? Mm-hmm. What Chicago ROAR does is focus on institutional systemic racism and how to approach that from an anti-racist way.
Okay.
And so we help organizations, if they don't have the budget, figure out how to secure the budget, how to use the budget, and then put together a team of people at all levels of the institution to figure out actually how to do long-term anti-racist transformation. Mm-hmm. And so we began there with the Presbytery, thinking about what are the goals of the Presbytery, how do we put a team together, who should be a part of this team, how do we talk to the leadership at the judicatory level, at the level of the Presbytery, and then build a team and think about how do we actually engage in anti-racist work.
If somebody attends a church congregation in the Chicago Presbytery, they might be called to be a part of this training?
Absolutely. Often the question is asked, should we start from the top and work down? Should we start from the bottom and work up? Chicago ROAR recommends focusing on all of those, that it's a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach, and all of the stakeholders that are involved with the Presbytery. The Presbytery, for instance, has relationships all over the city with other denominations, and there are other programs within the Presbytery. There are various churches. All of those voices and perspectives need to be involved in the conversation if the organization like the Presbytery is actually going to do transformational work.
Okay.
And so the work of Chicago ROAR is to partner with an organization like the Presbytery to figure out how to do that in a sustainable, long-term way.
And so, Chris, if there are workshops, are there misconceptions and preconceived ideas that we're trying to dismantle here?
First, we have to realize how the white supremacy has shapen and misshapen our attitudes, and that's part of the training. So the transformation team, no small charge, but we want them to root out and dismantle the racism and white supremacies that's embedded in the Presbytery. So Chicago ROAR has 11 hours of training that they all go through. Part of our team will walk through the training with them.
Okay.
And we really want the Presbytery to be multicultural and anti-racist, to kind of be a model.
Having done this work before, do you have any stories or anecdotes that you could share with us?
Well, you know, in Chicago, Chicago ROAR has worked with most of the major denominations.
Okay.
The Episcopal Diocese of Chicago has built an anti-racist transformation team that's been in existence now for over a decade. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Synod, the same. In fact, Chicago ROAR is a program of Crossroads anti-racism organizing and training, which was actually started by ministers from the Evangelical Lutheran Church over 30 years ago. And so we've worked with many of those denominations, and the reality is we recognize that people don't always know what white supremacy means. Sometimes we think about white supremacy as merely the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis. And so our workshops are in many ways an education. And what we're trying to do with those workshops is build a shared language so that we can all be on the same page when we talk about racism and anti-racism and what does that mean. And so a lot of that work evolves around that. In the beginning, we had people who would walk out of the workshops or storm out because you called me a racist or you think I'm a neo-Nazi. In more recent years, we don't have that as much. I think words like words like white supremacy have entered into our lexicon in a way more recently than hadn't happened before. So the conversations are more nuanced now, but not as shocking to as many people as they used to be. So it's a little bit easier these days to begin these conversations. But there's still a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what racism is and how it operates in organizations like the Presbytery.
Well, and in the church, I mean, there's been a lot of change in our country when it comes to racism, but Sunday morning is still a pretty segregated time in our country.
Absolutely.
Do we change that? Do you see change happening on Sundays and in our faith communities?
I think the only way that we can see that happening is to really start the conversation. Now, whether you see different ethnic groups or races mixing together, sometimes geography separates that. But I think the idea is for people to understand what white supremacy has done, how it has affected them personally. If we can get people to understand that, if we can get people to just, when they hear the term Black Lives Matter, that it does not mean that it is diminishing their lives, but it means that because of white supremacy and because of the privilege that that brings, it means that you don't have the same fear for your life that people of color have for theirs. There seems to be more value placed on the white life versus the non-white life. And basically that's all that Black Lives Matter. And I think if you can get people to understand that and to actually feel that, I think you can start to break down that whole idea of churches are the most segregated places on Sunday mornings. It's the attitude that we have to shift, and I think we'll see a shift in that.
And being able to internally shift that.
Yes.
Chris, what was it like for you to participate in this workshop as an individual?
It was, white supremacy was kind of like a punch in the gut. You know, white privilege is a little kind of nice and soft, you know, and hearing it the first time, but it didn't make me feel like I wanted to walk out of the training. I had done civil rights work back in the late 60s, early 70s, and I thought things, you know, were getting better, and then your life changes, you get kind of complacent, but the last few years, especially after Charleston, I knew I had to get involved again. And the first training that the Presbytery did was at our church, and we had about 100 people that showed up. And after the training, I told Barbara, I want more.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the training that goes on at these workshops?
For Chicago World, the training is just one of the tools that we use toward long-term transformation. And one of the focuses on all of the training is to understand that anti-racism and white supremacy is not just about how we feel about each other. It's quite different than personal prejudice. We want to think about the history of racism, both within the Presbytery, the Presbyterian Church, and all of our institutions. And so the training is a question of how do we not only build shared language, but understand the difference between racism and personal prejudice. To think about the systemic power that's at play that undergirds however we might feel about each other as individuals. And in that regard, it doesn't matter whether a church is diverse or not. It could be a suburban or exurban church that only has white folks, but there's still a need to talk about how structures play out in institutions. And so we have to add the question of power to the conversation. And that's the work that we do in the workshops, is to help people understand that, so that we're not talking about how we feel about each other or asking people of color to teach white people about race and racism, but how do we learn and grow together, including an historical perspective and a perspective about the history of the Presbyterian Church and the Presbytery of Chicago. That's the work that we try to do in the workshops. In my experience, I've had workshops where people have been a little bit resistant. And sometimes I've had people say to me directly, why do we have to talk about race and racism? We didn't have racism until you started talking about it. Can't we all just get along? Why can't we just talk about Jesus? And my response is, if we're talking about oppression, if we're talking about fighting oppression, if we're talking about fighting racism, then we are talking about Jesus. In fact, Jesus, in my estimation, requires us to talk about justice. So those things cannot be separated.
Absolutely.
And so for me in my faith, and I happen to be Episcopalian, my understanding of faith means that if I am truly a faithful person, if I am truly going to worship God and follow Jesus, then justice has to be part of the work that I do. Otherwise, Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace versus costly grace. And I believe that if we're really going to serve God, then justice has to be a part of our service. And that's why I do this work.
And justice costs. There's a cost.
There's a cost, absolutely.
There's
Absolutely.
a cost for doing justice.
So while we're talking about doing justice, there were some ugly racist statements made by our president this week. And I wonder if there's any counter messages we could offer to what has been said.
I don't know if I would say that there's a counter message necessarily.
Okay.
But what I would say is the focus on words that any individual says should not be what we're thinking about. What we should really be thinking about are all the institutions that the president represents, that the Congress represents, that the Senate represents. Our focus on words that we say that may be deemed as racist words, to me, is a distraction. One thing we can think about, for instance, is while we focus on nasty racist words that the president says, all kinds of racist federal judges are being put on the bench all over the country. And so if we don't think about the systems and the institutions that are governing us, and we're constantly distracted by the words of one man, even the president, then we're not focusing on the real harm that's being done by all of our systems and institutions. And I think that applies to the federal government as much as it applies to the Presbytery of Chicago, to the Presbyterian Church, and all of our schools, all of our institutions. If we focus on nasty things that people say, which is not unimportant, but what I think we do is focus so much on those things that we don't focus on where real power is being harmed. Think about the fact that people in Puerto Rico, 40% of the island, and these are American citizens, still do not have power. So we're focusing on nasty words that one man says, while the institutions that should be serving us, we're not paying attention to. I think that's the real issue with the words that a person like our president has said this week.
And I think, but there's an intentionality about keeping us distracted.
Absolutely.
There's a method to what is being done. And as you said, and I've said that we need to pay attention to what he is doing and not what he is saying. And what we are allowing all of these things to happen while we're getting caught up in these other things that really are somewhat inconsequential. Words are important, but actions are what's going to stay with us for a long, long time.
Well, and I am thankful for the words and actions that all of you are involved in to help us along. Thank you so much, Joyce and Derek and Chris, for being here today.
Thank you, Polly.
I'm Polly Toner for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.